Namaskar. We would like to welcome you all on behalf of Independent Research Ethics Society, IRES Samriddhi International Webinar Series at the milestone of 2402. Thank you. Thank you very much for your overwhelming support, due to which we are able to reach this milestone in 5 years, 28 days. So thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to communicate my regards to Professor Chandrabhushan Jha sir, Professor Lakshmikant Dwivedi sir, Dr. Navkumar Hajarika ji, Yogesh ji, everybody on the dais, along with our speaker of the day, Mr. Koshi Ibrahim, independent cannabis researcher from Bengaluru, and Dr. Shivaram ji, our beloved Shivaram ji is R&D scientist of Ayurnova Biolabs LLP and active in this mission of re-establishing cannabis due to legal wage. So thank you very much, sir, for joining, both of you. And without wasting much time, I would like to invite Dr. Shivram because he has already communicated his sentiments in last webinars. So I hope 10 minutes will be sufficient for him to communicate his sentiments regarding cannabis. Dr. Shivram, please. Then Mr. Koshi Ibrahim has requested for 35 minutes to 40 minutes because the presentation is great and he has experiences of Supreme Court in this cannabis case. I would like to request Dr. Shivaram. He is Shiva also, Ram also. Welcome, Swagatam, Swagatam.
थैंक यू सर। सभी मेरे गुरुओं को नमस्कार और जो भी मंच में वक्ता हैं उनको भी। मैं स्क्रीन शेयर कर रहा हूँ सर। सर स्क्रीन दिख रहा है ना?
यस यस, प्लीज शेयर भी कर दीजिएगा।
जी सर। तो आज क्या है ना, मैं दोबारा इम्पोर्टेंट पॉइंट्स जो एनडीपीएस में कैनबिस का जो भी इम्पोर्टेंट पॉइंट्स है वो मैं बताना चाहता हूँ। एक्चुअली आयुर्वेद में देखा जाए तो सारे पार्ट्स से हम दवाई बना सकते हैं। क्लासिकल मेडिकेशन अवेलेबल है, गांजा से भी बना सकते हैं, लेकिन अभी केवल भांग से ही बनाया जा रहा है। कोई भी गांजा प्रोडक्ट अवेलेबल नहीं है, लेकिन प्रोडक्शन कर सकते हैं क्योंकि क्लासिकल आयुर्वेदा में है। और जब देखा जाए तो इंडिया में कि कैनबिस की जो भी डिपार्टमेंट्स इन्वॉल्व है एनडीपीएस रूल्स को इम्प्लीमेंट करने के, वो दो है। एनसीबी है, नारकोटिक कंट्रोल ब्यूरो, और दूसरा है एक्साइज डिपार्टमेंट। जनरली जो नारकोटिक कंट्रोल ब्यूरो है वो इलीगल कैनबिस एक्टिविटीज के बारे में ही ज़्यादातर फोकस करता है, लेकिन जो एक्साइज डिपार्टमेंट है वो इसे साइकोट्रोपिक सब्सटेंसेस जैसे कैनबिस के टैक्सेशन या उसके कलेक्शन, प्रोडक्शन, मैन्युफैक्चरिंग, डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन और सेल्स के बारे में है। इसलिए सारे आयुर्वेदिक मैन्युफैक्चरर्स को कैनबिस प्रोक्यूरमेंट से पहले ही एक्साइज डिपार्टमेंट को इंटीमेट करना पड़ता है और उनसे परमिशन लेना पड़ता है। उसके बाद ही प्लांट मटेरियल मिलता है कंपनियों को। और जब हम एनडीपीएस में देखेंगे तो जो भी नारकोटिक सब्सटेंस या साइकोट्रोपिक सब्सटेंसेस है उनको मेडिकल और साइंटिफिक पर्पस के लिए हम यूज कर सकते हैं। लाइसेंस, गवर्नमेंट लाइसेंस देगी, परमिट भी देगी। और जब कैनबिस का डेफिनेशंस देखा जाए तो चरस और गांजा का डेफिनेशंस बोला गया है। गांजा माने फ्लेवरिंग पार्ट है और चरस माने जो रेजिन होता है उसका। और यहाँ पे सीड्स और लीफ का डेफिनेशन बोला नहीं गया है। सीड्स में साइकोट्रोपिक सब्सटेंस होता नहीं है, टीएचसी नहीं होता, तो अभी वो फूड मटेरियल की तरह अवेलेबल है, हेम्प हार्ट्स या हेम्प सीड पाउडर, प्रोटीन पाउडर की तरह। एफएसएसआई लाइसेंस से सीड्स को सेल कर सकते हैं, लेकिन लीफ इंक्लूड है कि नहीं एनडीपीएस में, ये एक डिबेटेबल क्वेश्चन अभी भी है। तो एक थोड़े और डेफिनेशन है, लाइक मेडिसिनल कैनबिस भी डिफाइन किया हुआ है एनडीपीएस में। मेडिसिनल कैनबिस में जो भी एक्सट्रैक्ट और टिंचर जो कैनबिस से बनता है उसको मेडिसिनल कैनबिस कह सकते हैं। लेकिन यह डेफिनेशन में देखा जाए तो कैनबिस डेफिनेशन में लीफ इंक्लूड नहीं है, तो एनडीपीएस के हिसाब से भांग मेडिसिनल नहीं है। ये बहुत ही बड़ा इट्स लाइक अ रॉन्ग पॉइंट, दिस हैज टू बी चेंज्ड। और यहाँ पे नार्कोटिक ड्रग में कैनबिस इंक्लूडेड है और साइकोट्रोपिक सब्सटेंस बोला गया है, और उसका एक शेड्यूल है, लिस्ट ऑफ 110 सब्सटेंसेस है जिसको कि साइकोट्रोपिक सब्सटेंसेस बोले गए हैं। ये सभी एनडीपीएस में आते हैं, और इस शेड्यूल में टीएचसी मेंशन किया हुआ है। ये है साइकोट्रोपिक सब्सटेंस के लिस्ट में टीएचसी 2 बार मेंशन किया हुआ है। और देखा जाए तो भांग की पत्तियों में भी टीएचसी होता है, तो डेफिनेटली भांग एनडीपीएस में आता है, एनडीपीएस के परव्यू में आता है, इसलिए एक्साइज डिपार्टमेंट इन्वॉल्व है। और जब रिसर्च के हिसाब से देखा जाए तो सीड में टीएचसी नहीं होता, रेजिन, फ्लावर, लीव, स्टेम, रूट सब में होता है किसी ना किसी मात्रा में टीएचसी। भांग के हर पार्ट में होता है सीड्स को छोड़ के। तो स्टेम और रूट भी आ सकते हैं एनडीपीएस के परव्यू में, अगर टीएचसी है तो आता है, इट्स क्लियर। ये इंपॉर्टेंट है कि स्टेट गवर्नमेंट को सारे रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस दिए गए कि इट कैन मेक देयर ओन लॉ, कैनबिस के लॉस बना सकता है हर स्टेट, एक्सेप्ट चरस। माने भांग का, गांजे का सेल्स भी स्टेट गवर्नमेंट पॉलिसी निकाल सकता है, लेकिन वो ये काम नहीं कर रहा है। केवल 3 अभी राष्ट्र हैं, उत्तराखंड है, मध्य प्रदेश है, और शायद हिमाचल भी है, जिसमें हेम्प कल्टीवेशन का पॉलिसी निकाला गया है। बस यही थोड़े एनडीपीएस के पॉइंट्स है जो आयुर्वेद के इससे जुड़े हुए हैं, जो इम्पोर्टेंट लगे मुझे। थैंक यू सर। और कोई
बहुत अच्छा
पॉइंट्स
शिवानंद
अगर
सर।
कोई मिस हुए तो आई विल बी ग्लैड टू नो देम।
So I would like to request now Mr. Koshi Ibrahim. Mr. Koshi Ibrahim, welcome, welcome.
Thank, thank you, sir. Sir, am I audible and visible?
Yes, yes, clear.
Um, sir, I'd like to share my screen so that I can give the presentation. I'm seeing it as disabled. Is my screen visible now?
Have you started sharing?
Just a minute, sir. I'm finding that the screen sharing option is disabled for me currently.
No, you can. You can.
Yes. Is the slide visible, sir?
Not yet. Here written Koshi has started. Yes, clear.
Okay, sir. Okay. Without wasting much time, I'll just get into the presentation. I want to talk about the NDPS Act of 1985 from a cannabis perspective. I basically want to talk about the history of cannabis prohibition in India, the state of cannabis in India in the 19th century, and a very important aspect of the prohibition, which was the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission. I'll quickly go through the key definitions in the NDPS and the sections in the NDPS, but I think Dr. Shivram has covered these subjects, so I won't waste too much time on it. I'll compare the NDPS with other major drug laws. And I've tried to talk about the impact of cannabis inclusion in NDPS, the benefits of removing cannabis from the NDPS, and I'll generally speak about the current global scenario with cannabis and the typical steps that cannabis legalization involves. The NDPS Act, I think, is quite, most people are quite familiar with. Basically, it was through a bill in 1985, passed through Parliament. It extends to the whole of India. The Narcotics Control Bureau was set up as a result of it. Mainly, the NDPS Act was set up to fulfill India's treaty obligations under the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the UN Convention on Psychotic Substances, and the UN Convention against illicit trade of narcotic drugs. There are 6 chapters and 83 sections in it. The NDPS Act comes under the Department of Revenue, Ministry of Finance, Government of India. This I found out because of my interaction with the Supreme Court, where I had to name the respondent for my petition, and that's how I understood that it is the Department of Revenue that has ownership over the NDPS Act. Speaking about the history of cannabis prohibition, many people think that the NDPS Act was probably the first step of cannabis prohibition in India. But in fact, the NDPS Act is not the first step. It is the last nail in the coffin, I would say, for India's cannabis culture. Many people do not know that the global cannabis prohibition started in India, and the NDPS Act was almost the last step in the whole process. So to understand cannabis prohibition in India, we must, to understand the NDPS Act, we must look at the background of how it reached this stage. If you look at the timeline of cannabis prohibition globally, the first place in which total prohibition was enacted was in Burma, but Burma was not really a cannabis consuming nation. The primary reason for cannabis prohibition in Burma was for the British to continue its opium trade, which it was using, growing opium in China and then transferring it to Britain. It started to extend this prohibition into India. Primarily, it started with the Bengal presidency and other provinces and presidencies that it controlled in India. So there was the Bengal Excise Act, which was set up in Bengal and Assam, the Bombay Excise Act. Then the similar excise acts were set up in the northwestern and central provinces and Punjab and Madras. In 1893, the British government decided to set up the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission to look at the feasibility of, till this point, it was only regulation. But in 1893, the British government started looking at complete prohibition and the feasibility of prohibiting cannabis completely in India. From this period to 1937, cannabis was gradually stifled in India. And we know in 1937, the US Marijuana Act was enacted mainly because the US was coming out of alcohol prohibition, and the alcohol industry, the newspaper industry, the pharmaceutical industry, all were lobbying to get cannabis prohibited there. Once the US prohibited cannabis, it uh, used its political influence to get the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Substances in place. But in 1970, the US Supreme Court nullified the Marijuana Act. But the US federal government immediately created its own Controlled Substances Act in which cannabis was placed. And in 1971, the same was extended to form the UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances. After this, pressure was put on nations which hadn't signed onto these treaties, and it was through this pressure that in 1985, the NDPS Act came into force in India. Now, we have to see how India was in the 19th century before all these steps were taken. At the start of the 19th century, in India, cannabis was a completely unregulated plant. At this point of time, there was only one place in the world which had ever thought about prohibiting cannabis, and that was Turkey, and that was in the 13th century. This was mainly the religious orthodoxy in Turkey that had implemented cannabis prohibition. At the start of the 19th century, you could consider India as the greatest cannabis nation in the world. Cannabis was an integral part of Indian society. It was part of medicine, spirituality, agriculture, and the economy. Cannabis grew freely across India in public places. There was wild cannabis growth across the Himalayas and extensive cultivation through the length and breadth of the country. Even in homes, it was quite common to have cannabis plants growing. As we all know, Indian society did not get destroyed after thousands of years of cannabis prohibition. On the contrary, India was one of the most coveted nations in the world. Various countries from all over the world wanted to trade with India and even rule and conquer India because of the vast wealth that India had. India became, as you all know, the jewel in the British crown. The British did not have contact with cannabis till about the 17th century. As per documentation, the first contact that British travelers made with cannabis was in Machilipatnam in Andhra Pradesh, when some travelers had used cannabis as a medicine to treat fever. And as you know, in the beginning of the 19th century, India was a mixture of British-controlled provinces, tributary states that owed allegiance to the British, and of course, independent native states. The British gradually introduced opium, Western alcohol, tobacco, and Western medicine during this period. And we all know that key administrative posts in the government was controlled by British officers themselves and Indian upper classes. Famous British physicians, including William O'Shaughnessy, used cannabis during this time to treat various illnesses, including tetanus in Britain. The measures that the British took gradually to stifle and regulate cannabis first started in Bengal and slowly extended through the Excise Acts to the other British presidencies. The goal of the British was to get maximum revenue from cannabis and to bring about minimum consumption. So the various steps and measures they took was they brought the area under cultivation in Bengal drastically down, from almost brought it down to about 5 or 10% of the original area in which cannabis was cultivated. This was mainly so that they could bring their administrative officers to supervise and oversee cultivation. Cultivators had to procure licenses from district collectors to cultivate cannabis. The crops were routinely monitored by government supervisors. cultivators had to inform the administration before harvest time so that the administrators would come and supervise it. The crop could only be sold to licensed wholesale vendors, and there were only very few wholesale vendors in for an area, thus creating monopoly over the trade of cannabis. Retail sale also started becoming controlled with auctioning of retail licenses approved by district collectors. A duty was imposed on cannabis at both wholesale and retail level. The number of retail outlets in which cannabis was sold was reduced and brought to a minimum. Slowly, punishment started being imposed for unauthorized cultivation, sale, and movement. The problem, of course, was that because the British presidencies were surrounded by the native states, which had totally unregulated cannabis cultivation, cannabis would flow in freely from other areas, thus negating the measures that the British were implementing. Home growing at this time, even though it was not illegal, was a gray area. What happened was that the retailers and wholesalers saw that through home growing, it ate into their sales and profits. So they started collaborating with the British government and informing them about home growing, and slowly home growing also got curbed. Limits were imposed on how much an individual could possess. And as I said earlier, the various excise acts were created in the British controlled areas. The unstated reasons for the British going into cannabis regulation was to promote their alcohol, opium, tobacco, and medicine, to increase the state revenue from the usage of the same. Because cannabis was completely unregulated and grew everywhere, there was no revenue or taxes that the British could get from it. Also, there was this view that cannabis users were generally troublemakers. They spoke a lot, they spoke their mind, they expressed themselves, they did not fear anybody, especially the sadhus and the holy men of India, who were widely respected, and everything they said had great influence on the people. So, and also there was the underlying intent of promoting British religions and trying to convert the Indian people to the religions that they wanted to establish. Various myths were created as a part of the anti-cannabis propaganda. Some of these myths were: smoking cannabis is a different drug from cannabis drunk as a beverage. Only lowest classes, castes, and other outcasts smoked cannabis, and it was called ganja and charas. The upper classes and castes would drink cannabis as a beverage, and they would call it bhang. Probably the biggest myth which had the greatest impact was the myth that smoking cannabis caused insanity. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, which I will talk about immediately, stated in its report that no other myth has caused more damage than the myth that cannabis causes insanity. Based on error, erroneous reports from the various Indian asylums which linked cannabis to insanity, many countries across the world imposed cannabis prohibition after 1880. Other myths that were created was that smoking cannabis would cause dysentery, bronchitis, asthma, physical illnesses. Smoking cannabis increased crime in society, and people who used cannabis were criminals. Smoking cannabis was addictive, and that smoking cannabis is more harmful than alcohol, tobacco, and opium. Along with these myths, there was also the myths that were created, said that drinking cannabis as a beverage does not create any of these harms, and drinking cannabis does not go against religious sanctions, but smoking does. Now, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission is a key part of the whole process of prohibition. It is because of the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission and its report that we are able to get a clear picture of how India was in the 19th century. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was set up by British Parliament in 1893. The primary aim of British Parliament for setting up the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was to study cannabis usage in Bengal, how it is prepared, how it's traded, the effects, and the feasibility of prohibiting the cannabis plant. The scope of the study was extended from Britain to from Bengal to all the other British-controlled provinces. Gradually, the Hemp Commission prepared a questionnaire of 70 questions, which covered important areas such as cultivation, preparation, trade, how cannabis is consumed, the effects, physical, mental, the administration of cannabis, the taxation and control. Since the intent of the British government was to prohibit cannabis, it selected witnesses who it felt would be biased in favor of cannabis prohibition. So 1,193 witnesses from all over India were selected. They included revenue officers, magistrates, senior police and excise officers, senior medical experts, and zamindars, landlords, prohibition advocacy groups, and missionaries from various religions. The emphasis was given to the evidence provided by medical experts, magistrates, and police officers. The main reason for giving emphasis to these three classes was to try and show the harms of cannabis and to try and link cannabis with crime. In this whole study, the native Indian medical practitioners were almost unrepresented. There may have been 4 or 5 native Indian practitioners who gave evidence. And of course, there was no representation from the sadhus or the spiritual mendicants of India. There was absolutely no women. There was nobody from the lower caste, nobody from the indigenous communities, and nobody from the working and laboring classes who were part of this whole evidence-giving mechanism. The key findings of the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was it found all these myths that I previously stated to be false. By studying the evidence and by going into detail, cross-examining the witnesses and studying the reports, it found almost every single one of these myths were false. It found that the Indian use of cannabis was primarily in the areas of medical, recreational, and spiritual usage. Industrial use was very limited. That is the usage of cannabis fiber for making various products was very limited. The cannabis was primarily smoked by men. Women, if they used cannabis, drank it as the beverage. And for children, especially infants and young children, it was mainly given as medicine in the form of sweets. The cannabis resin production in India was very limited in that period. Mostly cannabis resin came from places like Yarkand, which is basically the northwestern part of India, and Nepal. It was found that men started using cannabis generally after the age of 18. Women, because of all the stigma and the myths associated with it, generally started using cannabis, if they did at all, in middle age. Once people started using cannabis, it was generally a lifelong habit. The commission found that cannabis usage in India is very much comparable to how beer drinking happens in Europe. So people would, at the end of the day, after a hard day's work, get together, gather in a general village or a town setting, share cannabis and talk and relax in the evening. It was found that the majority of the cannabis users were all regular users, but moderately consuming cannabis. It was found that only 5 to 10% of the consumers were what would be considered habitual excessive users. Now, these terms moderate, excessive are all very subjective. There is no definite ranges of how many grams was consumed to, but it was generally terms that they used very. So what I consider moderate and what another next person considers moderate or excessive varied from person to person. But it was found that the bulk of the habitual excessive users were the spiritual mendicants or sadhus and fakirs of India. And it was found that they were in excellent health in spite of this so-called excessive usage. The great religious significance was associated with cannabis usage in India in the 19th century. So it was almost practically every religion in India used cannabis. The Vaishnavites, the Shaivites, the Sikhs used cannabis, but because their religion prohibited smoking, they drank it as bhang. The biggest community, of course, was the followers of Shiva. They were by far the largest users of cannabis. Some of the statements that the Hemp Commission made when they did the study was that they found cannabis to be probably one of the most important medicines in India. They also found that cannabis was one of India's major agricultural crops. And of course, they found home growing across India. They found that cannabis was available in retail outlets across India, just like any other agricultural commodity. A typical retail outlet would sell many things, and cannabis was just one more of the products sold. It was found that the cannabis was essentially the herb of the poorest people in India. So it was used as medicine for intoxication and for spiritual purposes by the working laboring classes, the lower caste, the indigenous communities, and the holy men of India. It was found that on an average, about 50% of the working and laboring classes, those who were involved in hard physical labor in very tough conditions like heat, humidity, working for long hours, especially the boatmen, fishermen, coolies, all smoked, about 50% of this community smoked cannabis. It was found that 90% of the holy men of India smoked cannabis. It was found that the priests of the Jagannath temple in Puri, certain specific communities like the Chaubes of Mathura were extensive users of cannabis as beverage. The upper classes of India regarded cannabis as a beverage as a different drug from cannabis that was smoked. Generally, the upper caste and classes regarded smoking cannabis as evil, but drinking as a not evil practice. Now, one of the reasons why the lower classes probably did not drink cannabis as a beverage was because the beverage consisted of making of various other ingredients like nuts, spices, milk, etc., which most of the lower classes probably would not have been able to afford. Despite the measures taken to regulate cannabis from 1850, which I had mentioned earlier, 20% of the state revenue in 1882 for Bengal came from cannabis sales. Not only that, cannabis was exported to England and other European countries. Now, the confusion between the words bhang and ganja was there then and is still there now. We can see from the evidence given by the various witnesses to the Hemp Commission about how much confusion was there between what you would call ganja and what you call bhang. The Hemp Commission itself came to the conclusion that bhang is the name for consumption, and it is probably the method in which cannabis was consumed prior to smoking. It was found that more towards the south, especially in places like the Madras presidency, the term bhang was almost unknown. It was generally the word ganja was what was used to for the cannabis plant. Now, whether cannabis was first smoked or drunk as a beverage, even humans started using it, is something debatable. But from what I understand, I think that the bhang comes from the use of from Sanskrit. So the origin of the word bhang comes from Sanskrit, whereas ganja probably comes from Tamil language. So the conflict between what is bhang and what is ganja probably is a reflection of the conflict that might have existed between the various societies in India at that point of time. When the Hemp Commission studied cannabis, they found that it had I just used the word 108, but it had a vast number of names. It was called by so many names, by so many people and so many communities across India. Along with it, so basically these names show, in fact, the various properties of the cannabis plant. It also shows that how much widespread the usage of cannabis was and how long the plant had been used, because only then can these various names come about. It also, of course, showed how much the people love the plant, especially when you see the names given. That which gladdens immediately, the dispenser of happiness, and delighter, and cementer of friendship. These were all the various names that were given to it. When the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission posed the question of cannabis prohibition, out of the 1,200 odd witnesses, about 500 to 600 odd people only responded to the question. Out of the people who responded, 87% of the witnesses were against cannabis prohibition in India. And these were especially the more experienced, high-standing people who responded, such as medical experts, magistrates, excise officers, and people with respect in society from various areas. So this, in fact, is quite amusing, because the whole intent of setting up the commission was to try and justify cannabis prohibition, but they found that the key people were all opposed to it. The reasons why these key people opposed cannabis prohibition was, they said that, for one thing, it will go against the religious liberty of India. The second thing is that it is almost impossible to implement prohibition, because it is so widespread and so much a part of India that you cannot implement prohibition without having a very, very extensive administrative machinery. And they also said that prohibiting cannabis will result in society moving towards much more dangerous substances like alcohol, opium, tobacco, datura. In fact, William Shaughnessy, the famous British physician, himself said that, compared to the evils of alcohol, opium, and tobacco, cannabis is nowhere as dangerous as any of these substances. Now, the key recommendations of the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was, it said, yes, regulate it, but don't prohibit it. It said you should give probably separate licenses for opium and cannabis sales, because at that point in time, a single retailer could sell both. Don't give group licenses, because it'll create monopoly. Don't let wholesale vendors have retail license, again, because they will control prices. Allow people to consume cannabis wherever it is sold, because it is not, people who consume cannabis are not violent, and it is, you don't find violence like you find typically associated with alcohol. They also suggested limits on possession for cannabis, which they stated recommended 5 tolas for ganja and charas, and about 20 tolas or 1/4 share for bhang, to be the how much a person could have. Again, this was because, like I said, around the British presidencies, all the other native Indian provinces were all had no regulation. So easily people could bring in from these other areas, and that would effectively make the measures of the British government zero, when if smuggling was easy. The main conclusion of the Indian Hemp was that no, prohibiting cannabis is not justified, especially because it again summarized what the important key people who had given evidence had said. It said that it is going to be strongly resented because it is interfering with religion. People will be upset about it, and it would lead to the use of more dangerous drugs. So its final verdict was that they completely said that such a violent measure as total prohibition should not be done in terms of any of the hemp drugs. So, of course, they call it hemp. The hemp drugs included ganja, charas, and bhang. The key definitions, so from the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission and its findings, I just talk about the various definitions in the NDPS Act. Again, since Dr. Shivram has already dealt with this, I will just quickly go through these slides. The definitions for what is a narcotic and what is a psychotropic are essentially taken from the UN Single Convention Treaty. So it says narcotic means cannabis, opium, poppy straw. Psychotropic, it says, are a list of substances which are specified in a schedule. So both what we see from this is that both the NDPS and the Single Convention Treaty, instead of defining what these properties are, give a list of random plants and human-made compounds and say these are what you call narcotics or psychotropics. Now, if you look at the dictionary meaning for narcotic, it says a narcotic is something which provides pain relief, sedation, anxiety relief, stimulates a person. The dictionary definition for psychotropic is something which alters a person's mental state. Now, all common things that we have on a day-to-day basis can all fit these definitions. We also see that the leading pharmaceutical drugs in the world today, painkillers, stimulants, sedatives, antidepressants, are all part of this. And many of these do not even need prescriptions and can be freely purchased from medical outlets. The questions that come from these definitions of narcotic and psychotropic is narcotic and psychotropic properties desirable or undesirable for human health? For example, is the alteration of mental state from ill health to well-being something that is desirable, or is it an undesirable thing? Now, what is the basis on which that these certain plants have been included in the list? Have all the plants in the world been tested? Are there scientific ways in which you can measure the narcotic and psychotropic properties of substances, and have all these been studied and then decided that these 3 plants should be there? What about plants that are considered toxic but are also used as medicines? Should we regulate and destroy all the plants and that exist in nature that we consider harmful? Key question is, why is alcohol and tobacco not in these lists? And one of the main things is, shouldn't regulation of substances be restricted to what are manufactured by humans in labs, synthesized products, instead of looking at nature and trying to control nature? One of the things we see is that every year hundreds of novel psychotropic substances come from the lab, and these are not updated into these schedules or lists. A classic example is fentanyl, which is supposed to be 50 times more potent than heroin. Fentanyl was not part of the NDPS Act till the world created a big hue and cry about its dangers. India and China are some of the biggest producers of fentanyl, and fentanyl was marketed and sold from India and China to across the world. It was only when various international communities highlighted the dangers of fentanyl that it was finally added to the NDPS Act. So the NDPS Act, we see, is a very rigid, stagnant, out-of-date system which isn't in tune with reality. Again, Dr. Shivram spoke about the definition of cannabis, so I will not go into it in detail. Again, but the key points are that the exclusion of seeds and leaves are based on the Single Convention Treaty. One interesting thing we see is that in the Single Convention Treaty, it says that the convention does not apply to cannabis cultivated for industrial or horticultural purposes. We see in the NDPS Act that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is essentially the most medicinal compound, but which is also the most targeted compound in cannabis, there is no mention of it in the definitions. There is no details about what levels of THC in the plant is safe or what is harmful. The key mention about THC in the NDPS Act is that if you have 500 grams of THC with you, it can bring the death penalty. we find not a single mention of the word bhang in the entire NDPS Act. We see only after the definition, we see the words ganja, charas, and hashish almost non-existent in the rest of the document, except where it says that 20 kilograms of hashish can bring the death penalty. Also, the way that hashish and charas are defined in the definitions, it appears like as if these are two different drugs. And we see that this ambiguity is there when you see a law enforcement report about how what drugs have been seized. You will find that they will mention hashish separately, charas separately, and ganja separately as three different drugs that they have seized. From the NDPS Act, we see that after the initial definitions of what is what, the Act then goes on and treats the whole plant effectively as being illegal. It doesn't take into consideration what the Single Convention Treaty said about the fiber and the seeds. Again, the questions that come from looking at the definition is a cannabis plant at the leaf stage without having the flowering tops or ganja or the resin, is it legal? How can one access the fiber which comes from the stem and stalks unless the plant reaches the leaf stage? How many people have been arrested for just cultivating a plant which was just in the leaf stage? How many cannabis plants have been destroyed? And billions of cannabis plants, I would say, have been destroyed. How can one access the seeds which are considered legal without the plant going through the flowering stage? Basically, how can we even consider different parts of a plant as legal or illegal? And most importantly, does law enforcement even care about all these subtle niceties about which is legal and what is legal? I don't think they do. They just see a cannabis plant and they will destroy it, or they will arrest the person growing it. I spoke about the resin, charas, and hashish, and the definition of addict in NDPS Act basically says that an addict is a person who has dependence on narcotic or psychotropic substance. We saw earlier that what is narcotic and what is psychotropic itself is debatable. Now, what is the basis on which you can identify a person as an addict? Can an external person looking at me say that I am an addict or not an addict? Okay, if we go by the definition of addict, aren't all the people who use synthetic pharmaceutical drugs addicts because they have dependence on it? You stop insulin usage for even one day, you might die. In an earlier presentation by Dr. Mahesh, he said that sugar is probably the most addictive, alcohol and nicotine are highly addictive. Why are these not featured in the NDPS Act? The NDPS Act and society in general consider even a single use of any of these substances as addiction. What is found has been found even by the latest studies and even by the Hemp Commission in 19th century is that an excessive user of cannabis, in spite of using it excessively for long periods of time, if the use is stopped, that person does not find himself in a life-threatening position. He might feel some discomfort. For example, if I'm drinking coffee or tea every day, if I don't get my coffee or tea today or tomorrow, I might just be a little irritated or sluggish, but it doesn't mean that I'm on the brink of death. So the correct definition for addiction should essentially be a biological dependency that builds up in a person's body, where if you stop that particular substance, that person might become seriously ill or even die. The sections in the NDPS Act related to cannabis, again, I will just quickly go through it because going into the technical details is very long and can take a long period of time. So basically, there are the sections 8 about and section 10.
excuse me,
Sir, yes.
मैं चाहता हूं कि बहुत शानदार है आपका प्रेजेंटेशन भी और आपकी स्पीच भी. So I would like to convert it into 3 sessions.
Okay, sir.
3 sessions.
Okay.
So please discuss elaborately everything
Okay.
because now our time for next webinar is expected.
Excellent.
So next means 3 session you break because your 22nd slide is there.
Yes,
But
sir.
you have the treasure of 60 slides, and we
Yes.
would like to have those blessings from you.
Okay, sir.
Really great, really great.
Okay.
So that means if you are convenient, please stick on the questions arising.
Yes.
We can leave here,
Okay,
and
sir.
then we in next session we will start from NDPS.
Okay, sir. So I will stop at this point of time. So from the sections.
Again, you can elaborate the questions.
Okay, sir.
What last slide, last slide.
Okay.
Yes,
Basically,
yes,
there are
yes.
various sections. So this slide just covers these two sections, which is about prohibition of operations and the power of the state. We essentially see that in the Siegel Convention Treaty, there was exclusion of cannabis for industrial and horticultural purposes, but in the NDPS Act, that is completely overruled. There is no provision given for industrial or horticultural use. It only talks about medical or scientific use. Now, basically, there are questions which I asked you, which are basically my questions, but I think the provisions are there for state governments to provide licenses, permits, and as Dr. Shivram said, you can apply to the excise department if you're an Ayurvedic organization and get a permit for use of cannabis for medical purposes. But some key questions here are: is home growing of cannabis, does it is it considered cultivation, or does it should you consider it as horticultural use or medicinal use or scientific use? For example, if I grow cannabis at home, I might be growing it because I like the plant, the I love the way the plant looks, so I will use it for decorative purposes, or I might use it for my own medical or purposes. I might use it to make a tea and to relax, or I might, of course, study the plant to understand how a cannabis plant goes from a seed to its final stage, which is basically a scientific study. Now, are only organizations allowed to do medical and scientific research? Aren't individuals? The individual, according to me, has the first paramount rights before organizations come into place. Organizations, because they are generally commercial entities, there are reasons for regulating them. But how can you tell a person you cannot grow a plant which nature has created? Now, that to me looks like a complete disregard for not only the individual but also the plant. Uh, at
For concluding remarks, I
uh,
would excellent presentation, Koshi ji. Excellent presentation.
thank you, sir.
Great to learn with you.
Thank you.
Great, great, really. मैं प्रोफेसर लक्ष्मीकांत द्विवेदी सर को सदर आमंत्रित करता हूं कंक्लूडिंग रिमार्क्स के लिए. प्रोफेसर लक्ष्मीकांत द्विवेदी, लीजेंड शास्त्री, एक्स प्रोफेसर एंड हेड ऑफ NIA. वेलकम सर.
नमस्कार. अभी दो विद्वानों ने भंगा के ऊपर में काफी जानकारी दी, वैधानिक भी और व्यवहारिक भी. आयुर्वेद के पक्ष में बहुत कुछ सूचना प्रद है. और इसी के साथ क्योंकि काफी लंबा चर्चा हुई और अभी कुछ शेष भी है, तो मैं साधुवाद देता हूँ वक्ताओं को, और आगे आने वाले समय में हम इनको सुन पाए, इसकी कामना है. धन्यवाद सर. पवन जी.
जी गुरुदेव. कोशी जी के पास मैं तो ये जानता हूं खजाना है गुरुदेव. आप सुप्रीम कोर्ट तक गए हैं, कैनबिस के पक्ष में केस लड़ा है, और उनने मतलब पूरी ट्रबल ली है इसको रीएस्टेब्लिश करने में. इसीलिए मैं उसका उनका अभिनंदन करता हूं. और यदि हो सकेगा तो कोशी जी, मिस्टर कोशी,
Yes, sir.
whether you are comfortable on Thursday 9:30 p.m.
Definitely, sir. I am.
Okay, okay. I will keep next session on Thursday 9:30 p.m. So we will be discussing again on the same point. But after this session where we have left, we will definitely attend. So for गुरुदेव का आशीर्वाद पूरा हो गया गुरुदेव.
Thank you very much, sir.
हाँ
Thank you.
नमस्कार, शुभ संध्या सर.
शुभ संध्या, शुभ संध्या सर. मैं डॉक्टर सीपी शर्मा सर को कंक्लूडिंग रिमार्क्स के लिए, फाइनल रिमार्क्स के लिए सादर आमंत्रित करता हूं. फिर हम लिंक चेंज करेंगे टेली कम्युनिकेशन डे के. डॉक्टर सीपी शर्मा जी कंफर्टेबल हैं? आदरणीय डॉक्टर सीपी शर्मा जी. मेरे ख्याल से कहीं ना कहीं उनका कनेक्शन गड़बड़ है, अदरवाइज वो अभी तक तो हमें आशीर्वाद दे ही चुके होते. मैं अगली वेबिनार की लिंक चेंज कर रहा हूं. कृपया मुझे 2 मिनट की अनुमति दें. कैनबिस एक ऐसा सब्जेक्ट है कि जो रीएस्टेब्लिश हो जाए, ये